everyone. I'm very excited to welcome today my colleague and friend Maya Mikdashi. So Maya and I will be in conversation for a while, 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for questions or comments. We will be joined online by an online audience, so welcome everyone. Unfortunately, the online audience will not be able to pose questions, so this is just going to be between us. So let me introduce Maya. Maya Mikdashi is an associate professor in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. Maya has been published in several peer-reviewed journals, including the International Journal of Middle East Studies, the Investing Quarterly, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the Journal of Palestine Studies, and the American Indian Cultural Research Journal. She's also been published in peer-reviewed edited volumes and in public-facing venues. And of course, we all know Maya as the co-founding editor of Jadalia. But today, we're here to discuss Maya's book, first book, called Sextarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon. So, I've read the book and I really enjoyed it. And what the book, there's so many different layers to it, but on one level, the book provides us with a new way to understand state power while theorizing sex, sexuality, and sect, and how they shape and are shaped by law, secularism, and sovereignty. And Maya does that in the context of Lebanon. So on one level, it is an ethnography of that it takes place in Lebanon, but the issues that she raises are much more widely relevant. I certainly felt they resonated a lot with Iraq, right? And sort of the intersections of sexuality and sectarianism, especially as it pertains to the personal status code. So to start out with, Maya, I was hoping you could tell us a bit about your journey. It's a bit of a cliche journey, but the trajectory in relation to the book. How did it come about? What were your academic, political, and personal motivations and aims and interests?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, thank you for having me here. It's really wonderful to be among colleagues and friends. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Nadia. And everybody who's here today. I actually wrote a big chunk of the book here in Providence. So it also involved lots of walks around this neighborhood. And, the book actually starts in Iraq, and that's not a coincidence. I was in Iraq in 2003 making a documentary film, a couple of months after the US invasion. And that experience really stayed with me and inspired me, I think, politically. And I went to graduate school not wanting to be an academic. I wanted to actually be a filmmaker. And being in Iraq sort of shifted my trajectory a little bit. And I was very naive, right? I thought, if I get a PhD, I'll have a stable job, and then I'll be able to do my movies. So that was obviously very naive. And I think the stakes of the book to me are academic and political, and also in some ways personal, I guess. So there's the actual two ways to trace the trajectory. The first is sort of like the physical, and being in Iraq was really opened my eyes in many ways to thinking about Lebanon in different ways, and thinking about kind of the Lebanon as a transnational space, but also as a potable kind of system of power, and how it was linked to other parts of the region and other parts of the world. For those of you that don't know, the Lebanese model very much inspired the American rewriting of the Iraqi constitution and the remaking of the Iraqi state. which people now live with. And then there's this sort of trajectory around my own academic life and my career. My undergraduate degree is in film and theater. My master's degree is in area studies. My PhD is in anthropology. My first job was in a Middle East studies department, and my second current job is in a gender studies department. And, if you show me any book, show me what you're writing, I'll show you what you're reading, right? So the book ended up also being sort of moving through these different fields, different conversations I had with new groups of colleagues, new classes, new sets of projects working with graduate students. And that's sort of how the book got composed across these also three fields of knowledge.
This idea of comparative perspective, I think that really resonates with me, and I also feel that being able to look at previous research through the lens of doing work in other countries. But just let me for a moment, because I was so excited to introduce you, I totally forgot to introduce myself. So to say I'm Nadia Ali, I'm the director of the Center of Middle East Studies, and I welcome you all. So I just remembered my detail. So of course the main title of the book is Sextarianism, right? And I've actually have seen some people refer to it and pretending it was their term, while I knew that you had been the person who had been, thinking and writing about it for a while. So it's not only that it's catchy, but it's very important. It's a key concept for your book, and simply put, it refers to the ways how gender, sexuality, and sect structure legal systems, but also how citizenship and statecraft are performed intersectionally in relation to sect and sexuality. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the term and unpack it for us.
Thank you. This is, I've seen that too. I do think that to me, in sort of, when I started doing my research, I was not necessarily interested in either sectarianism or gender and sexuality. I was interested in religious conversion and the debates on the secular and the religious that were huge in anthropology in our field. So, and then when I started doing my research, I actually discovered, and I was taught by the people I was working with, that it's kind of impossible to think about sectarianism without taking into account sex. That it actually, sectarianism itself doesn't function outside the vector of sex, as well as race and class and all of those other, which were more sort of common ways of analyzing it. And then as I started really sort of drilling down on the legal system, the bureaucratic system, and of course reading a lot of feminist theory on sexual difference and political difference and their relationship to state power, questions of sovereignty, questions of citizenship, I started thinking about, and it went through like several iterations, right? First I was like sex and sectarianism. Then I was actually in a workshop with a group of people, and I heard, and it started like going on in my mind, and I said, whatever, let's put them together. And it kind of, I think that some people think of Lebanon as a kind of exceptional space. To me, it's actually exemplary of many sort of global phenomena. One of them being that intense relationship between sex and political difference, sexual and political difference. The other being the way that secularism is practiced as kind of a management of religious difference, right? Religious pluralism. And third is how sovereignty is really sort of as a practice of state power that's very much interested in both multiplying and transcending difference. So sextarianism became a way for me to describe all of those phenomena while also thinking about it at multiple scales. So the first being sort of the ideological, the discursive, the way that politics and sex travel together. The second being the structural, law, bureaucracy. And then the third being the affective and the practical. And I think that as a term, it really helps us understand a global intensification around sexual and political difference and how they're increasingly traveling together, whereby people express political difference through discourse on sex and gender. And these political differences are hard felt. They have a very strong affective structure in ways that are similar to how we think or how we are told to think about sectarianism in our region, right? As being, it's not only political difference, but it's political difference plus extra, right? And that is actually, I think, something that we are seeing in the world. So I think Lebanon is a very good place to rethink an old question with global impact. It's similar to, for example, I was recently seeing the new Italian prime minister, right? And everyone was like, oh, this is the first time you have like a right-wing woman come into power, and isn't this interesting and how strange, right? And it's all on replacement theory, and then I read this French op-ed where they were like, replacement theory is a French invention, right? Like almost there was like some kind of pride in this. And I was thinking, replacement theory is actually, if you trace it through Lebanon, it's been there since 1948, since the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians into Lebanon, right? So it matters where you ask a question from. And even if you ask a question that's been asked many times, asking it from a new location brings new perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, so as I'm listening to you, I'm reminded that, you are one of the scholars in Middle East studies, also of course in gender studies, anthropology, who are part of this project. I think many of us are invested in it, in not only de-exceptionalizing the Middle East, but actually showing how the empirical work we do in the Middle East generates theory that is applicable globally. I think that's really important. And but before, I mean, I'm as an anthropologist, I'm always so interested in methodology and the process of doing research. So I wanted to ask you about that. But I'm just sort of conscious of the fact that I assume that most people in the room and who are joining us online might at this point not have yet read the book. They will all do it after the session, of course. But so if you like you're on a TV show or something, and someone tells you, okay, it's 3 minutes. So
God.
What is your book about?
It's the elevator, elevator
So
pitch.
how would you, what would you say?
This is like my terror in grad school. My mentor was like, you need to have a 3-minute elevator thing about your dissertation. I was like, no. Better be a long elevator ride. So basically, the book is an ethnography of state power. And it's an ethnography of the experience of that state power from multiple different vantage points, being, citizen, non-citizen, different gendered positions, different sexualities, different class positions, and different historical periods at the same time. It's ethnographic and archival, and it really tries to theorize and offer a way of thinking about sexual and political difference through these different scales, like I was saying, but also rethinking the question of sovereignty to ask, not what does it mean, but what does it do, right? And I think that is a question that has particular stakes, actually, for us. And that's partly, how Iraq really influenced me, I would say, is the stakes of that question are so high, so dire. And then the book kind of moves through different pieces. The first being, the structural. The second being the archival, the archival research that I did in the High Court, the highest court in Lebanon. And the third being the question of religious conversion, which I, in my research, discovered that what was happening when people were converting was actually they were converting into different regimes of sexual difference. So what I mean by that is, when I think about personal status law, which is family law, just an iteration of global family law, I really think we should start thinking about it as a law of just sexual difference. Laws, like, first of all, in anthropology, thinking about it with kinship, thinking about it with global family law, but also thinking about it as a disciplinary project to produce particular regimes of sex and gender. So, and sort of heterosexuality is a disciplinary project. So what I started seeing was when people were changing their religions, when they were converting, what they were actually converting into were these different kinship regimes, these different sex positions. And then another, the fourth chapter is actually on different projects of secularism that were also imagining the state, this sort of affective desire and imagination of what a state is and what it can look like, and what secularism and like as an ethical project is, as a, you know, an ethical project that's not so different than other forms of ethical projects, such as da'wah, right? Or and then finally, the last chapter is actually on sovereignty and on the experience of state violence. And it tries to answer the question and offer the perspective of, just because a state doesn't have hegemony over the use of violence doesn't mean that it's not incredibly violent. So how to think through those questions.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned in the beginning that your research entailed both ethnographic and archival methods, and you actually refer to, you call it an archival ethnographic theory and method. So I was wondering if you can elaborate on that. What does that mean? I was really interested in the way you were talking about the archive in Lebanon, which was very exciting, and you very much highlight the role of the archivist. So can you tell us about this archival ethnographic theory and method?
Yeah, I was trying to, you know, first of all, when I was very, again, like I was very naive. So I went to do my research thinking, I'm going to go visit all these different personal status courts and they're going to open their archives to me. What happened was when I would visit these courts, they'd be like, Maya, Mikdashi, you are this, right? So you can enter this court, but not that court. You can come and you're a woman. So you can sit here, but not there, right? Meaning literally, like, I'll give this guy who walks in a hug and I'll like wave to you from across the room. And so then I got access to actually the high court, which, and the high court, like all high courts around the world, solves disputes, right? That's kind of the job of high courts, including the Supreme Court, right? So it solves disputes and it decides jurisdiction, correct jurisdiction. And access to this court gave me a state-centric, sort of systemic view of the personal status system. So I was able to view it holistically as an integrated system and as a system that is not, in some ways, I think we epistemologically separate it from other bodies of law, but it's very much integrated into state, civil, secular, criminal, all different bodies of law. And being in the archive, and being able to dwell there. And I have to say, we can only do the research that we have the resources to do. So I was very generously funded, which meant I was able to be in Beirut for 2.5 years and really sort of dwell in these spaces. And I was in these fields of sort of ethnographic anthropology, ethnographic approaches to the archive, and archival approaches to ethnography at the same time. And I found that actually feminist methods were something that helped me bridge those two different approaches, because I would not have been able to do my work without the collaboration of the people who were working in the archive, in particular, someone who was very formative, named Mona, who plays a big role in this book. And I wanted to find a way to acknowledge the fact that academic knowledge production is really a collaboration. Like, it comes out as a single authored piece, but we're never sole authors, actually, of the knowledge that's being produced. And there's a way that decentering authorship allows you, I think, to view the archive as a more multiple place, let's say. And that's sort of the method that I came up with. It's highly, and the theory that I offer is like archival research as highly contingent, first of all, recognizing that whatever you do has already been done for you, right? So like when you enter a space, it's already been curated for you. Recognizing them obviously as lived spaces, but also kind of giving up this idea of control, really living with this question of contingency, not only in terms of being in a place that, like there's a lot of violence and the archive closes, the archive opens, the archives gets burned, it gets bombed, but also the contingency of knowledge production itself. You happen to show up one day and meet this person who's there on that day by chance, and they change your whole trajectory. And that's not coincidence, that is knowledge production. That is how it's done. So that's kind of what I offer it as kind of a feminist method, like to give up control and to see where that giving up does, what it does.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated you reflecting on some of the tensions as well with Mona.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really interesting. So you mentioned that one of your chapters was on secularism, so I'd like to probe a bit more into that, because you actually referred to it as evangelical secularism at some point, and you talk about the various forms of mobilization in terms of the resistance to sectarian politics. And I was reminded at some point when I was visiting Beirut, I think I was part of one of those marches that would be under the label of evangelical secularism. So, but your argument goes much deeper and shows how people imagine secularism as a system of rule and also a way of being in the world. But you also show the link between activism to promote the secular that has a missionary character, hence the evangelical part, and also that actually promotes a nationalist state project that's really crucial and key. So can you tell us more about this term evangelical secularism and what is your argument?
Egypt was on my mind actually a lot when I was working on this part of the book. Initially, it was actually called Da'wa secularism. That was the original way of thinking about it. And then through multiple revisions and maybe listening to too many people, I changed it to evangelical secularism. And to me, the term does two things. First of all, the people that I was working with... Sorry, I'm just going to open this. It's going to make some noise. I need the caffeine. The people that I was working with had a very, I would say, they had a kind of hearts and minds kind of way of thinking about change, political change. And, all activists kind of face the same. And this is a global question that people have to ask in social movements. Unfortunately, it's also a question that people ask in war machinery. Which is basically, do you change hearts and minds first? Right? So do you have to change the social world before you change the law? Right? Or before you make structural changes? Or do you make structural changes first because it's just the right thing to do? Right? Or in your political universe, that's what you want to do. And this is a question that people were asking in Lebanon. And like everywhere in the world, it broke down under similar terms, like liberal, Marxist, radical feminist, gay rights activist. It broke down under very similar sort of religious activist lines. So evangelical secularism to me points to, first of all, its genealogy, what it was drawing on, which included da'wah politics, Islamist political formations. So in some conversations with the founders of Laik Pride, which is one of the big marches that I trace through its inception to its performance. They would reference Islam huwa al-hal, right? Like that is kind of, and then they would say la al-almaniyya huwa, like, right? So they would change it with secularism. And so that is one genealogy, but it was alongside queer movements, gay pride movements, alongside long-standing anti-sectarian organizing. So there was this belief that one needs to change the culture. So people need to become secular before you can remove sectarianism, right? And that question clustered around debates and controversies that have been had that are sort of echoing throughout decades. The role of Palestinians, demographic threat, right? The role of Christians in the area. And the different iteration here was sort of queer rights. Those were the three controversies. So to me, this mode of politics, to describe it as evangelical, points to its liberal mode of this sort of hearts and minds. Like, first you need to promote, and people need to change before you can have structural change, right? Otherwise you'll have backlash. And it also points to its genealogy coming in some ways from da'wah politics and from other forms of, and I think it actually shows an interesting conversation between liberal modes of activism and da'wah understandings of change through the question of temporality. But this is also happening in a context where it's a post-colonial context where across not only the Middle East, but the colonial world, the colonial mission was to create citizens, right, as a sort of missionary project and a civilizational project. So it also draws in that genealogy, which I think is very important to understanding the echo of hearing, we need to create citizens before you can change the system, which is something that the French Mandate put in place, actually. That was the logic, in some ways, of the French Mandate in Lebanon and the question of sectarianism. And then the final part of why evangelical is important is because of the particular resonance and importance of Christianity in Lebanon. And here I think it matters where you ask the question from. When you ask a question about religious pluralism from the location of Lebanon, okay, you really see, and you have to contend with the plurality of religious difference and the plurality of religious political power, right? And Christianity itself becomes a very, and the resonance of discourses on Christianity in the region becomes really heightened when you ask the question from Lebanon. So to me, the term evangelical brings in all those different layers.
Yeah, well, I mean, thinking again sort of comparatively in terms of Iraq, I mean, that would be very different if you were to ask that from Iraq. It would be totally different given the fact that, especially following the invasion, so many Christians have fled Iraq, and it's a very different kind of power dynamic, right?
Yeah. And I was actually doing some of this research after Mosul, a lot of Iraqi Christians came to Beirut, right? So there was this idea that is very powerful, and I think we have to take seriously, that Lebanon provides this space, right? I think we do have to think about that critically. And the other, I'll end, I guess I'll end there. But I will say that there's something has always interested me, and this is part in that chapter of when people talk about ending the political system of sectarianism, the fear in Lebanon is always that there will be a Muslim-dominated state, okay? And that is seen as somehow more or concerning, let's say, to the ethos of Lebanon, right? As being this like state built on religious freedom, religious pluralism, individual rights. However, pre-1990, the state was dominated by one religion. It was dominated by political Christian power. But those fears were not the same, right? That didn't inspire the same kind of fear. And I think that is, again, sometimes the conversation about Islam, secularism, Christianity operates in some ways. We think it seems to be taking place in Europe. Some of these questions around civilization, racism, Islamophobia, but they're also happening very much in the Middle East. And in some ways, different states are founded on this concept, on this old discourse, including Lebanon and Israel, I would argue.
Yeah, very much so. To say that, Maya, one of the things that really surprised me when reading the book was the way that religious conversion is being employed in Lebanon, and it's being employed, very sort of strategically for people to get out of marriages, to get a divorce, but also crucially to optimize resources. And I mean, I thought this would be unthinkable in a place like Iraq, for example. So can you share some of the ethnographic examples that show how conversion works and what roles they play in Lebanon?
So I would say like this, the question of religious conversion brings up a different form of secularism than evangelical secularism. So if evangelical secularism is very much centered on an ethical project of self and other, religious conversion really brings out state sovereign, like state practices of secularism, which are very much in that sort of, mode of regulating and managing and determining the jurisdiction and the space of religion and public life. So religious, I'll start with the story. As anthropologists, this is what we like to do. I was sitting actually in a seminar in Islamic law in graduate school, and somebody brought up the question of conversion. And another student was like, no, don't, what are you talking about? This is apostasy. There's no conversion. I was like thinking, I know like people in my family, like I know so many people who have converted out of Islam into different forms of Islam, out of Christianity in different forms of Christianity. And that's where this sort of thing started moving in my head. And certainly, religious conversion is a phenomena, okay? And the kind of religious conversion that I trace in the book is in order to maximize resources, including resources that are linked to particular legal rights, such as divorce, such as custody, which, all of these things are kind of adjudicated differently. Lebanon has the highest number of religious family laws in the world. Following Lebanon is India. So just imagine, right, this kind of scale, the question of scale here. And when it comes to actual sort of questions of resources, the most common kinds of conversion are from Sunni to Shia Islam, and they're gendered in the sense that if you don't have a son, okay, in Sunni personal status law, Sunni family law, the inheritance law is more diffuse, let's say. Other heirs can kind of come and take parts of the inheritance or make a claim on it. Whereas in Shia Islam, daughters will inherit the entirety of someone's estate. However, if there is a son, then the same rules apply everywhere, right? So that's sort of one of the most common forms of conversion. The other is the conversion of Muslims to Christianity in order to write a will and disinherit somebody. Right? If there's somebody they really want to disinherit, then they can convert in order to write a will. And then Yeah, and a lot of this is about also, in terms of resources, divorce settlements.
Yeah.
In what law somebody imagines they'd get a better divorce settlement or be able to like hoard more money and not give as much money to their spouse in terms of divorce. And actually, I think it's interesting to make the comparison to other forms of legal pluralism that are not only about religion. So, for example, in the United States, there is a form of religious legal pluralism around marriage law. So it actually matters where you get married, where you get a divorce, right? That's why people will file divorce in California, because the law is more advantageous, right? Or Detroit or whatever, right? Like there are forms of legal pluralism all around the world, one iteration of which is religious legal pluralism. And whenever there is a system of legal pluralism, people are very savvy. You know, they know how to work, they know how to move around the system. And there's nobody more savvy than a lawyer, right? Like at a legal system. So it also sort of creates a system of expertise around these forms of legal pluralism. And sometimes I think if we make the comparison broader to not only, let's say, personal status law, religious personal status law, sectarian law, but just family law, legal pluralism, you start to see the strategic nature of living within a plural legal system, one of which is the mechanism of religious conversion. Of course, the practice is highly gendered, highly classed, and you know, there's like an example in the book. Well, I'll give two examples. There's one in the book that I really love, which is this woman who, well, maybe, okay, that's a good one. So she's a Sunni woman married to a Shia man, which is very, you know, it's not even an issue. But they had a very sort of love-hate marriage, right? Like she described it as like crazy in love, or crazy in love and crazy in not love. So they had been divorced twice, and she wanted to get a final divorce, and he said no. Okay, and because of that particular system, only he could initiate a divorce. So you know what she said to me was like "halabsu tanura," which is a very sort of sexist phrase. I'm gonna make him wear a skirt, right? And so she embarked on a very long project, I guess, to divorce him, and to divorce him under her terms. So she tried many things, and one of which was conversion to Christianity. Now, I have to say, this is happening in the 1980s. Okay, so her conversion to Christianity happened, I think, 88 or 87. So during the middle of the Civil War, which also has a sectarian component. So she converts to Christianity, and thinking, okay, this is it, right? Like, I'm gonna then go, and then she goes to the Muslim court, and she's like, I'm an apostate. Like, give me a divorce. Like, that's it. I'm out of here. You know, like, and then the husband's like, I don't mind that she's a Christian. And the sheikh goes, well, you know, in our law, it's okay for you to have this kind of marriage. And then she has a different narrative. She's like, oh, he's a gambler, he's a drinker, he's abusive, and they don't care about the abusive part, right? They're just like, tell me about the gambling, tell me about the drinking, tell me about the corruption of the minor's morals. And so finally she gets a divorce in that way, but then she has a different problem. Now she's Christian and her kids are Muslim, which has implications for custody, implications for inheritance. So then she has to go back to being a Muslim, right? So she has to reconvert to Sunni Islam, which ends up being a project again, because the first sheikh is like, what is this? Like, last week you were Christian. Like, what's going on here? And then she like goes out, wears a different headscarf, and goes sees another sheikh who's like, okay, fine, like, let's do it. And so that's one of these stories that I love. And then the person who gave her the most problems was actually the civil clerk who had to register all these conversions. And he told her, like, in 1 month, you go from like Muslim to Christian Christian to Muslim, and you're registering all of these things. And she just like had a tantrum in front of him. And she's very, she's one of those women that we all recognize, and like these very strong, like, I'm gonna show you kind of figures, right? So she really, she really is always very, when I speak about her, I see her cigarette, I see her nail polish, her foulard, So that's one story. And another story is actually about a family. Maybe this is a little more complicated, but it is about a divorce and about custody. And there's a couple that marries without converting. So she's a Muslim, he's a Christian, and they get two marriages. They get married in the Muslim court, but they don't register it. So clearly that's just like to appease her family. And then they get married in the Christian court with a special dispensation to say they can be married. And they register that one. So technically the kids are Christian. They get into a big problem. They want to get divorced. And the Catholic court rules in her favor because she says, look, I've never been a Christian. And I never lied about not being a Christian. And this guy's a disaster. Like, he can't be a father. He's a very bad, he doesn't even live here. He lives in Qatar or wherever the hell he lives. So they give her custody. The Catholic court gives her custody over her minor children. And after that, he goes and registers his conversion to Islam. And then goes to the Muslim court and says, oh, well, we're both Muslim now, so it should be the Muslim court, right? And then he gets a different ruling from the Muslim court that gives him custody. So then they go to the high court to settle this dispute. And ultimately what ends up happening is the Catholic Church, the state rules that the Catholic Church has jurisdiction, because what matters in a religious conversion is not intent or faith. What matters is bureaucracy. This is how religious freedom is being expressed here. Or at least the equal right to religious freedom lies in the fact that everyone has to follow the same rules. That's kind of the understanding. So what ends up happening is that the Catholic courts gives the Muslim woman custody over her Catholic children. And he loses, right? But it's a very, they're very complicated stories.
Yes, but they're also fascinating stories. I'm conscious of time,
yes.
I want to open it up, but there's just one more question I'd like to ask you, which is much more sort of a general one that I've been asking several of our speakers here around, which is the question about what a queer feminist lens might contribute to Middle East studies, and how your work contributes to understanding of what queer studies might mean in relation to the Middle East.
That's such a small question to end on.
And you have 2.5 minutes.
Oh, wow, okay. Sorry, I should have been more conscious of my answers and time. So I say in the book, right, this is a queer feminist book. And what I mean by that is that it tries to keep an eye on and engage with both queer theory, feminist theory, queer activism, feminist activism, and attend to the fact that they're not the same thing, right? They overlap, but they're not synonyms. They contain as many tensions as they do intersections. We know this just from our work. And also to make the point, and part of this is what I've been talking about, right? So if you reframe personal status law as laws of sexual difference, it opens a whole new way of thinking about it, right? If you say, oh, actually sectarianism is about disciplining women's reproductivity and disciplining heterosexuality, that opens up a new way of thinking about sectarianism. If you just say, you know what, I'm really tired of sexuality studies, meaning the study of queer sexualities in people. I think heterosexuality is really weird. I want to study that. I want to know what the hell's going on there. That again then brings open like a new sort of lens, or like perspective onto old questions. And I think it's important to say that not all queer work is feminist. And not all feminist work is queer, right? That is not only in relation to Middle East studies, but just to general sort of academic knowledge production. So not all queer studies work pays attention to gender difference and structural forms of gender difference. And not all work that is feminist pays attention to sexuality as a construct and gender as a project, right? So in the Middle East, for example, a lot of the really wonderful feminist work on things like religion and personal status law takes gender for granted, right? Or takes heterosexuality for granted as just the thing that is, right? Similarly, I think a lot of queer work on the Middle East doesn't take seriously the very different intersectional experience of queerness and its gendered stakes, its class stake, race stake, but definitely gendered stakes. And that is something that if you do any kind of social movement work, it's impossible to ignore. So in Beirut, I am involved in both queer and feminist activism. And like all queer movements around the world, these movements have splintered around the question of whose questions get centered, whose concerns get centered, right? Particularly in a place where there are such enormous stakes, structural differences between gender, right? So why is it that 534, like laws criminalizing unnatural sex, have taken such a huge part of the agenda when half of queer people can't give citizenship to spouses or, to anyone, or half of queer people can't even have their own ID as an individual person? Who gets to determine the agenda, right? This is a global question. So that's kind of what I mean.
Thank you. So I'm going to now have questions, comments. Thank you so much, Maya, for sharing almost like days and stories. I was struck by the mentioned it several times, the idea of an ethical project itself. And I'm someone who has a little bit of allergies to the idea of a stable ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And in the trenches of navigating all those different positionalities and legalities of managing that, it doesn't look like, according to the ethics, the stable ethics is more of a more turbulent sense. So could you elaborate more on that? And then the other question I have is sort of like the evangelical secularism, and sort of I was wondering if that kind of liberal turn, in a way, kind of shames like Christian or Muslim, like with a certain identity to accepting queer and more feminist projects, if they're trying to like see like appeal to the liberalism. How does that contingency and whether the exactly the idea of getting shamed into accepting those or supporting those projects.
So when I say ethical project, I mean I'm like drawing on a kind of Foucauldian, and he traces it through Aristotelian and Sabah Mahmoud's articulation of what that means of an ethical project, to build the self. And it's to build the self through action, right? So the idea is almost like as much as you practice and as much as you change the outside world, right, that will have an effect on building the self, right? And that's kind of, and I think that's very different than state projects of secularism. And it is it becomes an identitarian category. So one of the ways this got articulated was by saying, we have almost achieved this secular status, and now other people, we need to educate others, right, to become like us. And one of the most important ways to do this is just to show people that it's possible through things like taking over public space, changing, even if just for 1 day, 2 days, right? Changing the sort of cosmology of space, right? Cultural cosmology of space, in the hope that it produces different kinds of self-acting through intentional acting, right? That will cultivate this secular self. And I should say here, secular means anti-sectarian in this context, okay? And the question of the secular is always contextual. So that's why like French secularism looks very different than American secularism, looks very different than Turkish secularism, looks very different than Lebanese secularism. And that should be okay. Secular pluralism. There isn't one model. When it comes to like being shamed, I don't know if it was, so one of the ways that it broke down was over questions of queer rights, what role, what kind of visibility queer rights should have in these kinds of projects. The other was over the right of women to grant citizenship, because it ended up being a question about demographic balance, the specter of more Muslim citizens. So, you know, part of what happened was because it was such a large coalition, people made all kinds of compromises, and then people were not okay with those compromises, and it was a big sort of very interesting debate, which I think shows in some ways the expansive nature of what it means to come together under a big coalition, what it means to work under the least common denominator kind of politics, right? What kind of sacrifices people make. And when it comes particularly to queer politics, it showed how large the queer movement actually is, and how people don't agree with each other, which is wonderful. That's what it means. You're like, yeah, okay, this is a strong movement, because the leaders of the Laïc Pride movement, for example, many of whom were queer, okay, and were out, like they were out, but then when they wanted to work in a very big coalition with groups that had been working on anti-sectarianism for a long time, they faced a lot of homophobia, okay? And at the end, like, they came up with a kind of decision, a shared decision around the place that queer signage and calls for queer rights would have in the Laïc Pride movement. But then the queer community got really angry. They were like, what the hell, you're making this concession. You don't have the right, I'm gonna come anyway. You know, I'm gonna bring my rainbow flag. And to me, that is actually evidence of the fact that this is an incredibly deep, diverse constellation of social movement. They weren't the only people that were angry. Radical feminists were like, how can you give up on the right to citizenship? How can you kowtow to basically like sectarian demographic xenophobia and just give up the right to citizenship? But that's kind of what it takes to work in a large coalition.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 last questions.
So there are 1,000 things I wish I could talk to you about, because this is really fascinating, and I teach a course here on so many sexualities, and this is definitely one of them, so this is the next time I teach it. I guess I have a question about just big categories, and this is again because of my ignorance and not having it read the book, so it's just to elaborate on. I'm wondering about what conversion is doing, given everything you've told us now about. If secularism is anti-sectarianism, does that mean it's a kind of ecumenism? Sorry, throw a church term up there. Where so that religious boundaries are fluid or porous, I guess you'd say, and people can feel free to kind of madhab shop. Then what is conversion doing in that kind of environment? Because conversion seems to me to signal a more strong crossing over from one community to another, whereas what you seem to be describing is a soup of a community where people feel free to madhab shop. And I wondered especially about the term conversion in the example of Sunnis and Shiis, because they're not converting from one religion to another, but just from one legal school to another. And a lot of this is coming out of my perspective as a pre-modern person, where this is a fascinating phenomenon in the pre-modern world. I'm thinking of the work of Uriel Sumanson, who wrote a book called A Common Justice about Jews and Christians seeking recourse in Islamic courts in the medieval period because they found more fluidity there. And then Tamer al-Laythi's work on that with Egypt and Christians and Muslims there. So I'm just wondering how conversion operates in this anti-sectarian but very religious world you described.
Yeah, Avi?
I have a question about how sectarianism sometimes can allow spaces for articulation of alternative sexualities and practices. So, and I know it sounds weird, but there is this kind of, when you look at Lebanon in a comparative lens, the fact that you don't have religious dominance of one particular court or one particular religious class sometimes allows for alternative spaces. Do you think, based on your research, that there is a bit of that? Like, for example, like when you look at movements in a place like Jordan or a place like Egypt, you do get the full weight of the state behind it in a way that is, you know, it's like you're dealing with state power in its organized bureaucratic sense. And Lebanon's sectarianism in a way weakens the state. So sometimes activists talk about this. The weakness of the state allows for certain alternative spaces. Do you think, based on your research, that there is some that, I'm not, by the way, putting a pro-sectarian argument in any measure, but just wondering if that came up in your research or it's something worth thinking about.
Interesting question. So unfortunately, I have to stop here. So
Okay.
just,
Okay, I'll try to do this quickly. And I'll start from the end, the last question. So, I think that, and this is kind of the last chapter of the book on the state, in particular the regulation of sexuality through violence. I think Lebanon does have a different, I don't know if it's because of the pluralism of religion and religious authority, because mashallah, all religions are very homophobic, and they're all right. There's nothing. The Catholic Church in Lebanon is very politically powerful, and has been really kind of the spearhead of a lot of campaigns against queer life, queer artists. Not even just queer artists, but artists, like when I was doing my research, there was like a Brazilian carnival that was performing in Lebanon, and the Catholic Church went crazy, and it got shut down. So all of these religions, from the mufti, right, there's a mufti and there's the patriarch, and then everything in between, they're all deeply focused. And this past summer, there was something that brought all these groups together again over the question of gay pride. But I think, so I'm not sure if it's the difference of religious pluralism or the fact that actually what makes Lebanon a little different in terms of the region are the structures of the state. It's not a police state. It's not a state that has a robust capacities of sort of securitize, or they do have robust capacities of securitization. But they operate very differently than, let's say, a place like Tunisia or a place like Jordan, right? The security branches of the state. And there's also a legal difference here. And I do think this is partly what you're talking about. We still have a law on the books that is the Ottoman law, actually, of association. What that means is that any group that organizes itself into a structure, you apply to the state for recognition, but just because you've applied means you can operate legally. You don't have to wait for the response. That's the legal gray area that a lot of queer groups operate in, okay? So they've notified the state, which means they can legally operate, even if they don't get, and they can be visible, right? And have those kinds of protections that are state protections. So I think that plays a big role. Having said that, the last chapter of my book really does take on the question of what I call the epidermal state which is what the experience of state violence feels like for vulnerable groups, whether those groups are non-citizens, sexual minorities, heterosexual women who are maybe having sex before marriage or not, because that's a legal case about a hymen exam, which I talk about in that book, in that chapter. And importantly, there's a story about Lebanon, about queer rights and its difference in the region. And it is different. We have to recognize, it is different. That's why queer people from around the region do come to Beirut, especially. Beirut and Istanbul are the two kind of places that people come to. However, it's a very highly intersectional experience. So recently there were legal cases that everyone was like, oh, this means the end of criminalizing homosexuality in Lebanon. These are huge wins, right? But the people who are actually in the case are mostly, and the people being rounded up for police are not citizens. They're migrants, they're Syrian refugees, mostly. And that same ruling that found homosexuality not unnatural found that person had overstayed their visa and deported them. But that's never the story that gets told about the decriminalization, right? So I think that we really have to take an intersectional approach to the question of queer rights. And I hope that I offered a framework that actually helps us decenter citizens in that experience of state violence, because that's when you really do see the violence of the state and its ferocity in terms of the citizen, non-citizen question and the question of race also, because it matters in terms of migrant labor. And then, so, conversion. I'm gonna go back to my notes. So I think, the way that they kind of square this circle is they say it's not as if, and the reason I do call it religious conversion is because, first of all, that is what the state calls it. And also, the way it doesn't, and this is what the logic of the state is. We don't care what this means in social practice, right? So a lot of the cases I see, for example, a wife, and there's one that sticks out in my mind now, this man who was like a serial converter, okay? And he converted from Christianity to Islam. And his wife sued him and said, well, he only did this for legal reasons. He's still getting all his kids baptized. I still see him in church on Sundays. Clearly, this is a false conversion. And the state says, that's not my business. My business is, did he do his paperwork correctly? Did he file it on time? That's the only role that I have. And that's what religious freedom means, right? Is the role of the state to not interrogate questions of interiority, questions of faith. And I argue that this is partly due to the hypervisibility of religious sectarian difference, which means it's kind of a governmental category that is banal in the eyes of the state, right? Such that this kind of claim would be like, okay, that's not my problem, right? Did he do his faith? That's not what I do here. In some ways, it actually mimics, and this is what the Catholic Church is constantly arguing, that it kind of mimics Islamic understandings of conversion. Like, we don't, did you do the things correctly? And the Catholic Church is constantly arguing this. But so the idea of religious freedom and conversion is very much rests, and I call it the banality of religion. The banality of religion as a governmental category, right? That is hyper-visible. It's a sort of bureaucratic, it has a colonial genealogy, and it produces practices of religious freedom where the hyper-visibility of religious difference actually means that it's detached from viscerality or sincerity, right? That's not what it has to mean. Just because the state says that you're a Sunni, that doesn't mean you are. It just means that's what you are on paper. That's the kind of religious practices that it produces.
Well, thank you very much, Maya.
Thank you.
Really,